Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas tardes. El, el momento final de nuestro coloquio Abordar el pasado y quiero comenzar recordando una frase de Orson Welles acerca del final de las películas y él decía que para que una película tenga un final feliz depende del momento en que queramos terminarla. Yo creo que el final de esta película va a ser un final increíblemente feliz porque tenemos una excelente em, conferencia de cierre a cargo de Susan Lord con el nombre de Sensing Black Features in Sara Gómez Archives. La doctora Susan Lord es graduada de York University y enseña en el departamento de Films and Media in Queen's University. Ha investigado y escrito sobre cine, archivos, teoría de género, espacios urbanos y cultura visual. Es también directora de Vulnerable Media Lab, una infraestructura y a la vez un centro de investigación dentro de la misma universidad que se dedica a la preservación, migración y remediación de medios por parte de comunidades marginalizadas en las Américas. El volumen Killing Women, The Visual Culture of Gender and Violence, coeditado con Anne Burford en el 2006, fue pensado como una respuesta a la invisibilidad del feminismo y la presencia de mujeres en los nuevos discursos sobre la violencia en la pantalla. Y por su parte, el volumen Fluid Screens, Expanded Cinema, editado con Janine Marchessault, en el 2007 reúne un grupo de contribuciones teóricas sobre la expansión de las fronteras del cine y su relación con los medios interactivos y performáticos dentro de los saltos tecnológicos registrados en las inmediaciones del cambio del siglo XX al XXI. No obstante, quiero resaltar en estas palabras el trabajo de Susan Lord, dedicado al cine y a la cultura cubana. Antes de establecer el Vulnerable Media Lab, emprendió un estudio de archivo y comenzó a desarrollar una producción de base de datos digital del cine cubano y la historia cultural visual bajo los nombres de Digitalizing Havana y Decolonized Cosmopolitanism, The Visual Culture of Havana, 1959-1968, en los cuales trabaja con colegas de Cuba y la diáspora. Además, preparó un número especial de la revista Public en 2016 dedicado al arte en La Habana. Indiana University Press publicó el pasado año el libro The Cinema of Sara Gómez, Memoria y Revolución, el cual editara la profesora Lord junto a María Caridad Cubana y Víctor Fowler, colegas muy queridos. El volumen incluye materiales de archivo, entrevistas y ensayos originales de colaboradores cubanos e internacionales. De acuerdo con Juana Suárez, el material es una suerte de conversación entre intelectuales, académicos y críticos de cine cubano sobre Sara Gómez y su época. Además, las diferentes secciones del libro reafirman los profundos y complejos lazos formados con las categorías de raza, género y revolución, tanto en la obra como en la vida de la cineasta cubana. A modo de complemento, Susan Lord y el equipo de Vulnerable Media Lab están digitalizando, restaurando y subtitulando todos los documentales de Sara Gómez, un gesto hermosísimo. Sus proyectos recientes incluyen Archive Counter Archive, un proyecto de asociación canadiense que aborda el patrimonio audiovisual, Under the Shadow of Empire, Minor Archive and Radical Distribution Networks in the Americas, con Zaira Zarza y Juana Suárez, Amalia Córdoba y otros colegas. Y está trabajando con David Austin, Rafael Acosta de Arriba y otros colegas para construir un repositorio en línea de los materiales que estarán disponibles en español y en inglés del Congreso Cultural de La Habana en 1968. Así que bienvenida, Susan Lord. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. I am so honored to be in this company, and I feel tremendously pleased that I'm getting to hear such amazing work by the colleagues who have assembled here. Thank you very much for all of the organizing that the trio has done. It's been an incredible work of love, obviously, but a lot of work, and it's been a tremendous experience. I'm sorry that I haven't been absolutely present for each of the panels, but this is our end of semester, and our fourth year students are doing their showcase, and it's kind of intense. But you know, I believe that most of the people who have been assembled for this event are bring much deeper and longer expertise to this topic than I do. So I'm doubly honored. I'm sitting here on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people in the territory of Cataraqui. These peoples have cared for this land for millennia, and they now continue to live here and live alongside other indigenous people from other indigenous nations. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between indigenous nations to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And as a settler on these lands, I live with the intention that that covenant delivers. So I'm going to share my screen, and I think we could start that now. And we're going to hope for the best technologically. Let's see. Let's see if it'll work. Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, I think you folks are doing the sharing now, right? Is that right? Jorge? Yeah. So while that's happening, I'll just say that I want to dedicate this talk to those who have passed, to Sara. Oh, wow. That's a lot of screen. Wonder if we can get
yeah, because it's the screen, but if you open the PowerPoint,
yeah, I'll do it
first.
I'm gonna start the PowerPoint now. Here we go. Just let me know if it works. Is that working?
Let's see.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah. I MC the PowerPoint.
Not a minute. Okay, now oh shoot. I've got to, sorry everyone, give me a second. I've got to get out of this. I think I'm just going to share it when I try a second. There we go. I think I'm just going to share it like this. Is that okay? You'll see the ones that are coming. The slides that are coming. Okay, so I'd like to dedicate this talk to those who have passed, to Sara Gómez herself, to her son Alfredo, her friends and colleagues, Lalita, Rigoberto Lopez, and Thomas Gonzalez. I'd like to give a special acknowledgement to the very much alive daughters of Sara, Idia and Ibis. And I want to give gratitude to Luciano Castillo and Lola Calvino of the Cinemateca. The book that is on the screen here, The Cinema of Sara Gómez, is the result of decades of collaboration, of beautiful collaboration. And Maria Caridad Cumana has shared with me her vast knowledge of Cuban cinema history when I first started on this project, as did Gloria Rolando. And between the two of them, they helped me and gave me wind under my wings to keep this going. It's been a journey and a beautiful one. When the book final proofs were sent in, I thought that was it. Sarah's legacy in the form of the book is launched. There's so many more things to write about and say about her work, and the next generation will do that. And then Lola Calvino arrived with the documentaries, and we started this process of doing the digitization and restoration. And so Sara just keeps giving. So this talk is based on, of course, work that I've been doing for quite a while. And some of you may have heard me speak about some of this in the past. But I'm trying to, in the process of us working on in the lab on the films, a lot of things have been coming forward, and I want to try and tease out some of those lines of thought, as well as I digest. Actually, even though the work of the contents of the book have been out for a long time, it's interesting how you take different moments feed you in different ways. And so especially Odette Casamayor's essay and in the book, and the interviews with Lalita, for example, really have renewed a sense of focus and for me in my relationship to the material of this amazing filmmaker. So Sensing Black Futures in Sara Gómez's archive is, on the one hand, is a part of my ongoing relationship with Sara and with Cuba, and on the other, it's coming out of matters that we're talking about in the lab, about new archival practices and theories, including issues of what is a counter archive, or what is a decolonial archival practice, what are anarchives, and so forth. And as we work away on the series of Sara's films in the lab, alongside the work of doing the same work of digitizing and preserving the 25+ year legacy of an Inuit women's video collective, as well as other projects that have come to us, we're really confronting some real basic questions about when it comes to managing, digitizing, and restoring images that have perhaps, as our beautiful colleague Juan Carlos has discussed in this. Oh, I don't know if you can see it, this issue of Public on archive counter archives. He has a wonderful essay in there. As Juan Carlos discusses there, it may be that some images are incurable. One line of flight that I won't take very far today, but is very much part of where some of this is coming from and going, and maybe we can discuss it in the question period, is the use of archival images of Havana in music videos through which the Black public sphere is reclaimed for the future, where the images are claimed by and for Black liberation praxis. And so with that hope in mind, I'm going to try now to play this. And I just have to find my, where's my, here we go. Okay, here we go.
Guerrero en tu signo, fuerza. Acierto en tu verbo, fuerza. Mi tierra que fluya, fuerza. Manana, poesía, tu lengua y la mía, fuerza. Los secos se montan, fuerza. Se mandan los cantos, fuerza. Y suena el tambor pa' que tú le respondas y se carga mi ganga de fuerza con fuerza. Fuerza, rara. 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 Penetra la sangre, le sube, le hincha esa vena, acelera, se entrega, acompaña, se empeña, sonara, batalla, no mira ni calla, que atenta mirada. Con nada tropieza, reparte el dialecto de su fuerza, viviendo este puro, vibrando en su cuerda, desdobla cadencia, afroví su naturaleza. Dibuja el color negro con pimienta, 6x8 el tambor, 4x4 trompeta. Si no sabes, no te metas, cuenta. Fuerza, rara. 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 Con mi seco y con la fuerza del tambor, arrollando, batallando siempre voy. Con mi seco y con la fuerza del...
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Sorry about that. That was interesting. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. I'm not sure. We had double Telmari for that. So as I mentioned, Juan Carlos provides insights about preservation and curatorial practices. He writes, while it's important to continue the microbiological study of biodeterioration, I would like to argue that biodeteriorated films are incurable images that occupy a transitory and ambivalent space, which in turn opens the possibility to investigate the meanings associated with the destruction of film memories, but also with the memory of film's material decay. In this context, biodeterioration is one of the potential mutations of the film image, a film mycology. A film mycology could open up a path toward an ethic of vision that would be based less in the rhetoric of loss and more in the understanding of filmic mutations. As a critical and archival practice, it must invite us to consider how can fungal intrusion in the celluloid transform our conceptions of audiovisual memory, found footage, and archival film preservation. the sensible decolonial practice of listening to the image. So next to this, I want to add something from Tina Kemp and Fred and her reading of Fred Moten about the sensible and about the sensible and about Black subjects of photography. Kemp writes, explicating the affective and enunciative functions of these images provides the underlying rationale for an analytic frame of her book. An emphasis on the multiple sensate photographic registers that render these images meaningful and expressive cultural objects. As I have indicated, these photographs are not restricted to the sensory realm of the visual. They also register at other sensory levels that reveal our attachment to family photographs. While the affective force and cultural import of such images clearly manifests visually through the familial frames of reference they display, it also registers beyond them, in excess of the visual, and indeed beyond what we see, end quote. The sense of Black futurity, then, is one way of understanding how images like the one on the screen here, for example, or the ones that we will look at shortly, how these image functions, understanding how images like this function as archival agents for Black futures. She makes use of Fred Moten, focusing on sound as a critical interpretive frame of the photo, where Fred Moten urges us to engage in forms of looking that are, quote, attentive to the whole sensual ensemble of what is looked at. For, as he writes, the meaning of a photograph, and by that I also mean these incredibly still moments in Sara's oeuvre, is cut and augmented by a sound or a noise that surrounds or pierces its frame. And I don't mean a soundtrack in this case. I actually mean the kind of sonorousness of the image itself. So encounters, so his text challenges readers to think the constitutive supplementarity of visual and the sonic as a larger whole, in short, the whole sensual ensemble that is the persistent object of his interrogation. So encounters between tradition and modernity render an especially complicated yet productive space for the appearance of women and Afro-descendant people as citizens and agents of social change and cultural expression. The appearance of the new woman of decolonizing and post-colonial visual culture depends on collectivities and new mobile forms of social relations. Sara Gómez is a foundational figure in this regard. She began her documentary film practice in a period when what the esteemed Ana Lopez called the double vocation of artistic and political experimentation, when that was the norm in the early 1960s. And she continued to challenge conventions through Cuba's gray years of intensified censorship and control, and until her death in 1974. Each of her documentaries represents an experiment with the conventions of the genre and with the limits of social discourse. This experimentation participated in the new Cuban cinema's creative revolution by signifying a response to those elements of history, memory, and everyday life that were frozen out of the frame of dominant narratives of nation and subjectivity in colonial, imperialist cinemas, and indeed in the dominant macho and largely white activity of the Film Institute. In the creatively robust and politically complex context of the 1960s, Gómez stood out as a figure whose relationship to cinema, as she expressed in an interview that was published in it was in 1970, constituted her relationship to cinema constituted an act of decolonization. Across her films, this authentic act, her words, her authentic act, challenges the whitening and masculinization of the revolutionary subject, the monumental time of the revolution, racism and machismo, and the hypostatization of development, wherein transculturation risked being mere deculturation. Her work was encouraged, as many know, by Alea and Espinosa, for example, while Mi Aporte was censored by the FMC, which was the Federation Mujeres Cubanas, the very organization that sponsored the making of it, a film that has not been seen in decades and is going to show in New York. So this coming month, very exciting. My research on Gómez was inspired by the film festival Crónicas de mi Familia, New Cuban Film and Video in 1991. That event, organized by Ricardo Acosta and David McIntosh, brought together the then new generation of film and video makers for whom Sara was like a madrina. And they presented those new Cuban works with a full slate of Sara's films, including Mi Aporte. Those works of the next generation actively challenged racism, gender norms, homophobia, issues about AIDS, and so forth that were active in the late 80s and early 90s, many of which were produced via Hermano Saiz Institute. In the intervening 30 years, we have watched a growing gulf of racialized, economic, and social inequity, alongside and entangled with the uneven exercise of state control and censorship of artistic expression and its circulation. I wonder what Sara would say today, how she would use her camera and her place in Icaic if she still had one. And I want to know how her courage, risks, and determination to decolonize and to look at the unfinished work of revolution and the social inequities, and how this life and work can be seen as a legacy for the risk-taking citizens of July 11th on the one hand, and the emerging young women filmmakers who are striving to be independent makers in their own country or elsewhere on the other. And there's more elsewhere, as we know, every day. There is so much more to explore in her work and the lines of flight it opens. And I'm really hopeful that that there will be more, research connecting directly to this generation of makers who are now going to be able to have access to her films, many for the first time. So popular music, writes George Lipset, is a vital repository for collective memory because songwriters help create alternative archives of history. I say this is also true with films that make use of archival material. Each generation of media artists, broadly defined, builds their practice through a repertoire. Conversations across borders and generations deepen with each new work. Processes of remediation, archival fevers, and practices of the self develop nuance. But what happens when a big part of the repertoire is lost to you? When your archive is in a national building you can't access? When racialized economies are forbidding? When diasporas and displacements separate the person from their archive? Or when media materiality has decayed to the point of no longer being because it was never cared for by the memory institutions of the nation. When intellectual property, patrimony, and other forms of control over the history of place and belonging create blockages against access and critical or loving conversations with the past, and or really, because usually critique is also a form of love. In another version of this or line of flight out of this work is a discussion about Gloria Rolando's place in and practice of Afro-descendant continuous archiving. And I want to think about what kind of archive is possible given the material condition and disappearances, the fragmentary nature and hidden secreted images, the fetishisms of ruin and decay that is the focus of the critique in Juan Carlos, versus the mycology and poverty of abandonment. Is it a counter archive, an imaginary archive, an emergent archive, or is it it an incurable image? Rashina Campadou wrote a book, Creole in the Archive, Imagery, Presence, and the Location of the Caribbean Figure. And she calls her work a contiguous archive, and I kind of like that. So I want to play with it a little bit. These images, by the way, are from Guanabacoa Crónica de mi Familia by Sara. The image of the Caribbean figure, Campadou suggests, has been reconfigured by photography from the mid-19th century onwards. Initial images associated with the slave and indentured worker from the locations and legacies associated with plantation economies have been usurped by visual representations emerging from struggles for social, political, and cultural autonomy. Contemporary visual artists emerging with the Caribbean as a 20th or 21st century global space have focused on visually reimagining historical material and events as memories, histories, and dreamscapes. Campadou uses photographic analysis to explore portraits, postcards, and social documentation of the colonial worker between 1850 and 1960. And contemporary, often digital visual art by post-independent, post-colonial Caribbean artists. She conceptualizes the Caribbean visual archive as contiguous and relational, arguing that using a creolizing archive practice, the conjuncture of contemporary artworks, historical imagery, and associated locations can develop insightful new multimodal representations of Caribbean subjectivities. To this definition of the contiguous archive, I add the concept of counter archive, where counter archives are an incomplete and unstable repository, and an entity to be contested and expanded through clandestine acts, a space of impermanence and play. While in practice, the counter archive also entails mischief and imagination, challenging the record of official history. When employed as an artistic strategy, counter-archiving, quote, this is from Brett Kashmir, pushes our archival impulse into new territories, encouraging critique and material alteration, fabrication. To counter-archive is to counteract, to rewrite, to animate over, a take and give thing, a negotiation. And finally, one more little flight of theory here is from Diana Taylor, her work on the repertoire. And she talks about the repertoire as an assemblage of mediums, written, oral, visual, that document the memory around historical events in performative and more ephemeral ways. Archival memory, she asserts, remains fixed in and through time, but its value, relevance, or meaning is what it is susceptible to change and reinterpretation. So with that, I want to just take a little excursion into our process of working on some of the Sara films, with thinking about Chronica in particular. It's a singular, Chronica is the title, Chronica de mi familia, but there are chronicles. There is a plurality in this work, not just because of those examples of superimpositions and so on that you saw in the earlier images, but also this new layering, this apparition. Is it an apparition coming through, which is the mold? So thinking about this fungi as you know, yes, as eating the image and eating the soundtrack. In fact, the soundtrack from the remaining elements, the elements that remain of Sara's work. This in this film in particular, the sound is super distorted. So we have working with us someone who does a lot of audio restoration, and one of our major questions, both with the image and with the sound, is where do you stop? What is it? What are you trying to actually repair, and back to what? Do you keep the image? You clean the image, you take off the fungus digitally, of course, because you can't actually remove it. So the original element still has that sensible expression of neglect. But you can, with this software that we have, you can remove this evidence. And so what do we do with that? What is the ethical path to take? So is it fungus or apparition, or is it both? Is it a pluriversal? Is it a cosmology of decolonial temporality that starts to appear through these kinds of images? So one of the other kind of operative principles that we're working on when we're thinking about decolonial archiving practice is to, of course, talk about the living archive. And it's a concept that actually emerged in the 18th century with people who were naturalists, right, and thinking about ecology in those years, but is now being employed in the kind of archival world, thinking about indigenous and Black, Afro-descendant, BIPOC communities, queer communities, to think about the living archive as that which requires a certain kind of intention around, on the one hand, your metadata, so to develop good metadata practice that can kind of capture some of these themes that I'm discussing, the stories that are attached to those faces, to those bodies, to those spaces, and to also encourage. The living archive principle is to encourage not so much just preservation, putting something in a vault and holding it in time, but rather thinking about presentation, about showing work, about making the work available, and therefore producing the kind of future extension of popular memory. Through, therefore, exhibition practices and distribution and access become essential parts of the living archival practice. And that's one of the things about these kinds of platforms like we're on today that are so incredible. However, many forms and versions critique, and we should be watchful of them, as some of the papers in these sessions have given us a pause to think about. Nonetheless, this idea of being able to throw into the future those things, those works, those memories that have been neglected literally by or controlled through patrimony. discourses of patrimony. So I just want to present a problem, though. If the on the one hand, you know, I love this, and I'm going to show you a side-by-side of the sort of before and after of our cleaning up of this mold. So on the one hand, it's an incredible image to contemplate, and it gives you so much, a very deep sense of the kind of material culture also of the period. And of course, one of the things we know about this Crónica de mi Familia is a film about Sarah's family, and one of the things that we know about her family is that she comes from a Black middle class, and so while a lot of the history of photography of Black people was about dressing up for the photograph and about the staging and so on, and that's certainly true here. The dressing up in a good part of Sarah's family would have been going to the closet and getting the dress that exists in the closet, rather than working necessarily with the photographer. However, there's another story in that family. So anyway, if we keep this, if we keep the mold, if we keep the fungi, if we keep the evidence of neglect, if we don't clean that up, that tells us, that gives us one line into the future, right? One way of contemplating the Black image in the future, or giving the Black image a future. But I want to go to the other side of this and trouble it a bit, because this is an example from that the videos that were brought to Toronto to the Euclid Theatre in '91 by Ricardo and David, and they were, you know, this was the condition that they were in. So this really, whether we're talking about Crónica or Mi Aporte or, you know, most of the other films that were in that showcase, they did manage to kind of get around a little bit. There were VHS tapes that were shown, but this is the quality of the image, right? So we see this is Berta, the daughter of Manuel. Okay, we can't see Berta, right? However, in the restored version, Berta appears. So it's this idea of appearance and of the futurity of Black appearance that we are also negotiating and needing to think about when we're doing this work. What is too much? The line that you see kind of scratched down the side of the of Berta's child photograph is in the photograph itself. So well, obviously we're not going to touch that. We're going to allow that photograph to have its sensuousness, its materiality to speak to us. But we actually get here, we get Berta, we get to see Berta, not just see her, we get to see her looking at Sarah, at us, looking across the ages. So I just want to play this and hope that it works. Let me just a minute here. This is our amazing, one of our amazing technicians, colleague here, Jen Norton, she taught herself the software and is so excited by it. She made us side by side. So I'll just play a bit of it. And probably I should think this.
Este documental está dedicado a la señorita Luisa María López y Galainena, que le decimos madrina los nietos de su hermana. Pero no basta.
Okay, so that just gives you a little taste of that. That was partway through our process. So we've now finished the restoration, audio and video and the image restoration for Crónica Me Aporte and Isla Pedro Miguel. Well, we didn't do that one. They did it in Bologna. And next up, we're going to complete the documentaries by the end of summer. And you know that De Cierta Manera has been restored by Arsenal, by Marcus Roof at Arsenal Berlin. Okay, I'm not sure where we're at. Oh, I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly here, and then we can have time for discussion. So here is also an example of the third generation, and it raises a really interesting question for me again about what we take out, what we fix, and what we allow to be to be in to hold the record, its record of time, neglect, or use in this case. Because you think about this is a third generation VHS, it means of course that it was copied and copied and copied. And this is the opening title slide in Mi Aporte. So whether Sara's subject matter concerns the local, cultural, and political critiques of national work programs and election processes, or the diaspora indifference found within a family, her films consistently bring marginal identities into the frame, respatializing and remediating citizenship. Along with the strategies that reflect on the temporality of film processes, shot duration, montage rhythm, narrative, superimposition, and all of this, the cultures of time represented in the films include the subjective worlds of memory and everyday life, as in Crónica, the uneven development of social chronotopes, the different and or contested temporalities formed by cultural memory and practices, as well as gender difference. So here in Mi Aporte, one of the so this sort of poor third generation image can function as a discourse in a sense that it can function as a discourse that is reflected in the film itself. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll just give you a brief description. The film is an incredible example of kind of feminist consciousness raising documentary where it's in three parts. The first part takes place in the sugar workers factory. The second takes place in a discussion between Sara and some other women who are professionals and who journalists and sociologists and so on. And the third is in this format of this in the cine debate, where they show the first part of the film to the women who work in a tobacco factory. And the women then critique what they saw in the film in the first sections of the film. And so the film ends up becoming this kind of recursive discursive process of critique and intervention in machismo, yes, in the value of women's work, yes, but also in the revolution's failure to do what had been promised around women's access to work, daycare, and so forth. So what's interesting to me is that when we spend time with this debate section, there's a lot of editing, and it's short and kind of intense discussion that's happening between these women. But when we get to actually take some time with them and we watch the gesture and we watch the faces of the women being having this very animated conversation where a Black feminist, an emerging Black feminist, is being recorded to address the forms of negligence or the ongoing forms of repression of women's and Black women's potential in particular. So I think what I'll do is, let's see here. I want to move forward here. In her book about citizenship and photography, Ariella Azoulay proposes that we find a mutual relationship between the various users of photography. And I would posit documentary, obviously, as well. The documentary practice where, as Michael Renoff has talked about, the kind of basic documentary image of a person is a hailing, right? The person is before the camera saying, hello, I am here, I exist. That ontology of the image is something that I think Sara was deeply interested in her portraits of people, in particular of Afro-descendant people in the 1960s in Cuba. So to go back to Ariella Azoulay, she proposes we find a mutual relationship between the various users of photography wherein the photographed persons address the spectator, claiming their citizenship in the citizenry of photography. She writes, quote, an emphasis on the dimension of being governed allows a rethinking of the political sphere as a space of relations between the governed, whose political duty is first and foremost, or at least also a duty toward one another, rather than toward the ruling power. For Azoulay, the history of unequal access to citizenship is linked to appearance and disappearance. With democratization of access to the image, relationships are afforded a more extensive lateral dimension, and networks of appearance develop that can never be completely subsumed by the lens of the ruling power. In this space, the subject ceases to be marginal or dissident. Rather, this activity of appearance rehabilitates or remediates their citizenship. Citizenship is not a stable status that one simply struggles to achieve, but an arena of conflict and negotiation located in techniques and technologies of appearance. And this is precisely the legacy that Sara leaves for the current generation of viewers and makers. Most of her documentaries present participation as something that is practiced fundamentally as critical engagement. Mi Aporte is one of the best examples of the extent to which her filmmaking and the social subjects of those films together embody radical participatory democracy, thus participating in the larger project of modernity and the democratization of culture. Finally, it's worth noting that as much as that citizen is the citizenship and the social public capacity and potential of the Black citizen is at the center of her work. And we see here that she plays all the time with frames, there is always framing, very careful framing doorways, windows, women in these in-between spaces, and then occasionally walking out into the street. I love this image of this woman, this Black woman taking to the street. But there are also these intimacies, right, that she strives to develop, a kind of a conversation between looks, a set of gazes that are sometimes very direct, as in this case, or sometimes, as we can see here in this young girl in the background, a curious and as yet not fully public person. So I think I'll just end with that because I'm not sure how else to end. So I'll just end. So I'm going to stop my PowerPoint. And oh, I know. Let's stop sharing now. That's what I do. Stopping. There we go.
Excelente. So, excellent talk, Susan. So there are a lot of commentaries here in the chat.
Okay.
Juan Carlos, saludos. María Caridad Cubana.
Oh, yay.
Maribel Sofía, es fascinante. Michelle Lee, esto es fascinante. Judith Silva, gracias por traernos a Sarita restaurada. Susan, cariños desde Chile. Y hay preguntas. Aquí, bueno, voy a leer la primera pregunta. Juan Carlos Rodríguez, so interesting this idea of audio restoration in connection to listening, and what do we end up listening? Listening to fungal contamination, does it create singular sound effect affecting the perception of the material? Thanks for sharing this reflection on archival practices.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it depends. So much of it depends on your listening environment too. You know, like I was listening with really good headphones on, and I heard certain things, and when we projected it, you know, in a pretty good theater environment here in the university, there were certain things that I didn't hear, and then we showed Crónica de mi Familia in Cuba in December at the festival, and all you heard was kind of mud, like the voice was just mud. So I think there's some, you know, context of listening, issues around technology, access to infrastructure. There's all sorts of things like that. But I do think that there are, Brandon has worked so hard on that on that audio track to try and stabilize the audio. But every once in a while, and it's interesting which word it is that pops, right? That somehow, I'm not sure why, if it's that he overdid it or he underdid it, but it popped and it said, and the word is casa. So every time the word casa is said, it's louder and clearer than almost any other word. Now, I don't know why. I don't know that that's in the original recording, but that's the elements that we have. That's what comes out. So I would love to talk more about that. I think it would be super interesting to discuss that.
Thank you. Yo tengo una pregunta, Susan, because I see the relationship between the legacy of Sara and also Guillén Landrian. I mean, yeah. I am talking about the references, you know, todas estas cosas de archivo contra archivo, homenaje y marginalización, olvido y conservación, and also the references of the recognition in the new filmmakers to them emphasizes their present and also their future, you know, el presente y la futuridad. So how do you how do you see this connection? Pensando en tu presentación hoy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, okay, Nicolasito's work started to be available. I remember I was in Havana in, I don't know, like the end of the 90s or something, very early 2000s. And Juan Carlos Alom he somehow, I can't remember now how it happened, but he kind of got it. He got all of that work. And I was at my friend Manuel Pina's house, and we were watching that. And it was the first time that some of those artists had seen the work of Nicolasito, and they were crying, right? Because it was like, I mean, they were overwhelmed with the beauty and the kind of intensity of that obra, but also what they did not have access, the loss, right, for themselves and for others, but especially for themselves as artists, that they didn't have access to that as they were, in their early years of art practice. Sara, it's interesting because her work did have this moment of kind of access around those 90s, late 80s, early 90s filmmakers. But Zarza invited us to Edmonton, and Anna was there as well. And we, for a showcase, and there were young filmmakers that came to that event. It was an incredible event with Sandra Gómez and sorry, I'm just tired now. I can't remember, but I'll remember their names shortly. And they hadn't seen Sara's work, and they were crying for similar reasons that Nicolasito's work. And I think, when we were working on the Sara stuff at the beginning, and Caridad will remember the meeting that we went and had with Pacheco, and we were like, well, could Susan take the films to Canada to digitize them? And this was like 10 years ago, Carrie? And he said, no, it's patrimony, So anyway, it took another 10 years to get some kind of confidence, I guess, from there, so we could go ahead and do this. So my long-winded answer is to think about these futurities as not as unstable, right? That there are these moments where things arrive and then they disappear, and that there are these lines of possibility where something can move into a public memory, but then they can also kind of deteriorate. And I don't mean necessarily even material deterioration, but they can become uncurable images in a certain way, going back to Juan Carlos. So I know there's been a huge amount of interest in Nicolasito, and that there is a project going on, right, to digitize, to do restoration, digitization and work, and of his entire work. And I'm hoping that what will happen is that we can work together if we need to use the facilities that we have here, because we do have this crazy software, this Diamant software, to do that work of restoring the image. It would be really interesting to kind of bring Nicolasito into the lab with somebody who's really invested in thinking about his futures. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
eso sería excelente, eso sería magnífico. Hay una pregunta acá de Jacqueline Loss.
okay.
Susan, muchísimas felicidades por tu presentación tan abarcadora y por todo el trabajo que han llevado a cabo con la obra de Sara Gómez. Todavía no he formulado mi comentario del todo, pero pregunto si Venuti y los términos domestication and foreign foreign ayudarían a conceptualizar aún más estos temas. I'm thinking translation, I guess.
Interesting. Uh-oh. It's lost. How did that happen? I lost the connection to my browser has lost the connection to my camera.
I can hear you, but I cannot see you.
No, I know. I can click the camera button again. Okay, hang on a minute. Let's see.
All right.
We're going to work on that. Allow, done. Let's see if it'll work. Well, maybe you don't need to see me anymore. Oh, you can hear me. I'm not sure if I can get that to start again. But I'm not, yeah, Jacqueline, thank you very much. I think I'm not completely sure about those terms, but I'm going to think about them because I do believe that that might, it is, when we think about, how something becomes foreign, in particular, or how something comes to belong to an elsewhere, right? And I wonder, anyway, I'm not sure what to say, but I think it's a great line of questioning. So I'll follow up with you by email.
Yeah, I think it's about the theory of translation.
Right.
The idea of create, something new and to translate from one place to another or one language to another. And in this case, the idea of transnationalization. I don't know.
Yeah.
There are many things coming up with this question.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, that would be. Oh, I see. Yes, especially in terms of the work of restoration or the work of. I get it. Yes, I think that's interesting. Translation in that as well, right? Thinking about this as an act of trans. Anyway, I'll think about it. Sorry.
So Susan, if you wanna go below, you can see the microphone and the camera. I guess.
Oh, here we are. That's where I'm supposed to press the button. Okay, got it. Sorry. No. Oh, there we are. I'm back.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
So I have more questions here.
Oh.
So, Isdani Morales pregunta de qué manera es diferente el acercamiento a la revolución en la obra de Sara con respecto a otros realizadores de su época. Comparative question.
Interesting. So one of the maybe the one thing that I didn't talk about really that's worth noting is that Sara was the only person who in that moment, right, who really tried to think about in particular issues facing Black people today. So there, as we know, in the 60s in particular, there was a lot of work that was done about the colonial period and how, the revolution has solved racism and we're freed of that. And that, that moment in Sergio Ural's film, when she comes into the present, right, is so powerful because it's a rupture in this really impressive way. Partly because there was just so few images that were really focusing on the issues facing Black people and particularly Black women in that moment. So Sara's work was really focusing on that. on those on that issue. One of the things we learned about in the process of these incredible interviews that are in the book, with, for example, with Ivana Rocha and Garcia Mesa, her cameraman, is that she had this way of understanding herself in that environment. And she actually said, I'm going to do this, and they're not going to stop me because they need me, the little Black girl, right, to show that they're being progressive. So I'm going to call them on that. And I'm at, kind of, it's not a word for word, obviously, but more or less, this is what she used. She was very strong. And when we first started to try to interview people, like at the beginning of my research on her, there were some people who didn't want to talk about her because she was so difficult. She was understood as difficult. But she did really, she understood where the sort of social limits were, the political limits, the discursive limits, and she pushed at those. And she had, it's not that she was conflict free, but because they wanted to, and I think that it's, I have to say that everyone says that in the case of Espinosa and Alea, it was authentic support for her. But nonetheless, I think there was this, she understood that she was challenging things that other people weren't doing. There wasn't a shared discourse that she was part of in that area. However, at the same time, there are multiple discourses and going on in her work. It's not straightforward, and so I think that that's also interesting to kind of watch how her work as a revolutionary, her self-understanding as a revolutionary, her self-understanding as a Cuban, her self-understanding as a middle-class Black person, right? So she had a lot of those, like in terms of her own biography, but also in the discourses that she was generating in the work itself were multiple and sometimes contradictory. So.
Definitely, very contradictory, because I remember many scenes in her documentaries, specifically about high culture. I mean, it's a very old term. Pero como, por ejemplo, en Iré a Santiago,
sí.
Recalcando que los primeros negros cultos, como, algo que hay que remarcar, y era como una intencionalidad que siempre tenía en sus películas, like I am from middle class, I am a very race issue here, but I am I have to remark that I am a very una persona culta.
Sí. Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we know also that her the kind of I don't know, one of the more complicated moments in Desierta Minera is the and now we have a documentary section, and where they have this the section where there's the discourse about machismo, about colonialism and machismo, and Black, Afro-Cuban cultural practice, and how those two things come together. And it's very there. I mean, I've listened to it so many times because I keep wanting it to not be what it is. But it's very problematic. But when you listen to that, and then you actually you use it as one discursive modality, And then you see it in the other, Astrid, right? She was, Astrid gave a talk in this session. I couldn't see her because I was teaching, but she spoke about this when we were launching the book in Havana, a really interesting talk about the kind of multi-discursive layering that's in the film, where it doesn't settle easily. So yeah, it's interesting.
All right, so I have commentary from Ana López. Ana López comentó ayer algo muy parecido sobre su experiencia con Guillén Landrian en finales de los 90 en La Habana. Fue muy lindo. And also Sara Sarsa. What a labor of love this is, Susan. The politics of care of the center of these archival works you are doing is beyond words. Could you share a bit about future plans for the accessibility of this archive you are bringing back to life? When, where, in what format will they be available? Gracias. Y abrazo.
Okay. So I don't know who's listening. No, I'm kidding. I'm not really kidding. So I have an agreement. I do have an agreement with Ike that while I'm doing the restoration work, we've agreed that work will not be shown unless it's finished. You know, good. There's good quality and there's subtitles and it looks good, and then it can be shown publicly. And they've given me the ability to kind of control it this year, because we were supposed to already be finished everything, but COVID. So the lab was closed for a long time, and we're just sort of getting back up to speed. So I think what we're going to do is we're showing it we're showing it at BAMFA in San Francisco, a program next week, and then in New York at NYU and at Maisley's Center the week after. And I feel like at this point, because we're still in process with the restoration, that I really feel like we need to take it with us. I mean, there has to be a kind of framework for showing it at this point. But for the next year, it's available for me to kind of do that, have that power, as Juan Carlos talks about it, of the curator, and decide who gets to see it when, where, and so on. And then there's a plan, apparently, and it's a very exciting plan, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. But it starts with the C, and and there's you can think about boxed sets and things like that. So you can imagine. One of the issues for me, however wonderful that is, and I think that hopefully there will be a box set and it will have all of Sara's work in it and it will be spectacular. What worries me then is that who owns that? Right? Like, then how are people going to see it, right? If you, how? So I want to, I'm really trying to, I'm hoping for ways to have like platform access with not a lot of money required for people to be able to access the work. So I guess the answer is slowly, and hopefully within a year, everything will be restored, and then hopefully we move forward quite quickly after that for the box set.
Okay. So, Juan Carlos Rodríguez, es una pregunta muy parecida a la de Zaira en la naturaleza del tema. So many great ideas and provocations, Susan. Could you expand of the conversations that take place of the lab level when negotiating restoration decisions?
Yeah.
Thanks
so
again.
There are, how do I say that? I did my PhD in like technology and the body and theory and Foucault, and then I started to go to Cuba, and I felt like I had to then take a new PhD and change my life, and And now working on the archives, I feel like I'm doing a third one. Like I'm learning tremendous amount. So I'm learning with the students. So we're always reading best practices. I work really closely with Juana Suarez, who teaches me so much all the time about, thinking about practice and the living, really trying to enact the living archive. So what does it mean? It means that we share knowledge, we do workshops, we learn how to properly care for things. We have a cold vault for stuff to be properly stored. We wear masks when we clean the fungal material off of Sarah's films, all of that kind of thing. But these deeper conversations, like it was, Jen Norton who was looking at this as she was trying to figure out, is this mold on the photograph that is is this, you can figure it out. I mean, it's not hard to figure, you just move the frame and then you see the mold move. So, it's on the film and not the photograph, but it did raise all sorts of questions about what we're, when is too much. And I think this is the thing we spend most of the time talking about. When do you stop? And we're going to hold a panel that's specifically about that with like Marcus Roof from Arsenal and others who do this kind of work, because when you do when you make these transfers, when you scan the film and then you make a flat transfer. So we have these like super heavy files. They're like multiple terabytes of TIFF files of image files, right? That show exactly what we got. It's got you've even got the sprockets, you've got everything, you've got every scratch and every bit of damage is preserved, right? As such. So you can always access that kind of original. So the working copy, when we're working with a DPX and we're trying to actually then do this restoration work, we're on the one hand, it's just an experiment, like what happens if we go this far? And the Michelle O'Halloran and Rebecca Gordon were working on Mia Porta, and they kept trying to fix this one thing, and then they realized it was actually the result of a gesture. It was in the film. It looked like a mistake, like some kind of a flaw. But in fact, it was that woman who was speaking at whose image I showed you, who was like, had things to say. She was doing a lot of gesturing, and the rapidity of her movement was sort of caught in a strange way by the camera. So they kept thinking it was a flaw in the original, but it wasn't. It was actually her gesture. So, these are interesting conversations. And I think many people like Marcos and others who are doing this kind of work and who are really dedicated to minor archives, right, are having a different kind of conversation than what you would have in Eastman Kodak, right? It's a very different, but there's a big and incredible community to talk about that. So, yeah.
All right, Susan, we have just 15 minutes left. So, but there are a lot of questions and commentaries here. Yeah. So we can approach some of them at least. So Darien San Nicolas, thank you, Professor Lord, for this provocative presentation, archival intervention of sorts. Hearing you talk, I couldn't help but think of Derrida's idea of ontology, but especially Gordon's and Fisher's respective understanding of the same concept, at once as the drive of to act in the future, to umjant the present, and the impossibility to access any future. I wonder then what kind of Afrofuturism we craft when the body of the Afro subject and the body of their memory body has always been designated to this phantasmatic state?
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic question. And in fact, I don't know I'm not going to even try and answer it, except to say that that's what I'm trying to think about now with this project. And this, I only just learned about the camped book about photographs and Black photography, or the Black subject of photography, and the new book, which I haven't read yet, of hers on the Black gaze in photography and art and photography. So I'm going to do that. But I do think that one of the things that I want to be very careful about, and I would love to collaborate with anybody, have another conversation another time about this, is to make sure that we don't do the same thing that happened, we being, the North, the global North, North America, Canada, US, whatever, that we don't do what has all too often happened around Afro-descendant cosmologies and Afro-descendant politics and discourses from the Caribbean and from Latin America as well, that are very specific, and you can't cover it with Black power, Black lives, multiculturalism, whatever the reigning discourses of race are in my country or in the United States. And one of the interesting things about the 60s, that I think still, this is why we want to do the Cultural Congress project, or why I want to do it, and do it with David Austin, who's my colleague and friend, who has written a book called Fear of a Black Nation, because he's really interested in the Caribbean, intellectuals like C.L.R. James and so on, and Andrew Sulky, and the movement of those folks through through Canada. There was a really active Caribbean intellectual scene in Montreal that he's done extensive research about. But we're both really interested in that Cultural Congress for a number of reasons, and one of those reasons has to do with the ways in which decolonization, race, and revolution were so inadequately addressed. You probably know this story. Isabel Alfonso has done so much work on El Puente, and that group.
Perdón, who did the story?
Isabel Alfonso.
Okay, Isabel Alfonso.
Yeah. So she's done a lot of work on El Puente, and she and I presented a long time ago on this moment where the group of Black intellectuals, including Sara, right, who were part of the ethnography group, they were studying and working together and stuff, and they went to try to participate in the main events of the Cultural Congress, and they were told they couldn't, and there was some pushback, and there were a lot of issues that emerged from that included some people having house arrest and other people, the discourse of race and revolution really started to get really shut down, where in the earlier years, there was this sense of a Black public sphere, a kind of emergent Black public sphere, where groups like El Puente, groups like the ethnography groups, there was Sara, there was Nicolásito, there was this kind of energy around rethinking race. And it was not identical to what was happening in the US, right? And that non-identicality is interesting and is very specific. So I guess what I want to do in response to your question, Darian, is to think about what Black intellectuals in Cuba, or whether in or outside, in the diaspora, or how they are thinking about futurity in this sense of Afro descendant Afro-Cuban futurism. What does that look like, as opposed to the Afrofuturism that we're getting out of the kind of U.S. or British context? So I'm interested in that. So yeah, I think it's a big project, and I've been thinking a lot too. Whenever I do land acknowledgements, we just do them all the time now in Canada and sometimes in the States and that too. But I've never. What would it be like to do a land acknowledgement in Cuba? What would that be like? Because still, this is a whole other area of futurisms, right? To think about to think about that, and there are people doing research around, trying to bring forward these kinds of cultural histories and memories of Indigenous life. So I think it's a really interesting moment for these kinds of questions. It's just really hard to know how to go about doing that work when things are so precarious politically for people to do things in the country.
Ya, y es interesante pensarlo junto con el proyecto del puente en los 60, en ese momento. So I have a couple of more questions, but vamos casi a terminar. So Maybel Sofía Mesa pregunta lo mismo acerca del repositorio, si podrían usarlo cuando esté disponible en clases. Laura Zoe, what a tremendous labor and beautiful work, as others are saying, Susan.
Distribution, yeah. Well, that's, yeah, we'll just, Carrie Dad, there she is. She arrived in the question period. That's great. So do you want to read her, Carrie Dad's commentary? Do you mind?
El pensamiento crítico de Sara en esos años acerca de temas como raza, género y sociedad estaba conectado con lo más avanzado que existía en ese momento en los estudios sobre esos temas, dice María Caridad Cumana. Temas que formaban parte de los temas que el ICAIC estaba interesado en promover en esos años. No obstante, le permitieron hacer sus documentales y dar su punto de vista en esos temas. Mi pregunta para Susan, después de estar más de 10 años viéndola y en ocasiones participando con ella en el análisis de la obra de Sara, después de todo el delicado y cuidadoso proceso de restauración de la obra de Sara, en la cual ha participado activamente, ¿ha cambiado algo de tu percepción sobre el trabajo? Me imagino sobre el trabajo de Sara y sobre todo su proceso en el ICAIC, etc.
Yeah, interesting. So I think Kerry, I go back to in my memory, so often I go back to that moment when in 2004, when I was living in Havana, and we got a VHS player, and we had the tape of In La Otra Isla, and we watched it together, where at the end of that film is when Sara is listening to Raphael, and that's that image of the two of them so intimately connected to each other, listening as she's probing very gently to ask him to clarify. And eventually he does say it's racism. He actually uses that word. And we had this very interesting discussion in 2004 about that. It was hot. There was a lot of standing up and talking very loud that was going on. And I remember thinking, I know nothing. So That was a moment, a breakthrough moment, and Ketty, you kind of rescued me and my ignorance at that moment, and so I think what I saw at that moment was I was so focused on that last scene that I didn't actually look at the rest of the film with equal attention. And what I see now in the rest of the film is how Sara was interested in, yes, in race, but also very interested in the question of youthful particularity. There's in one of her films, in Isla para Miguel, there's this scene of Miguel and no. Is it Isla? Yeah, because it's the guy. Yes, it's Isla para Miguel. So, and there are these two young men sitting side by side on a step talking, and one of them is gay as shit. And I never saw that before, right? Like I was so focused on a very narrow sense of I don't know, I'll just say black and white, right? So I think that one of the things that I'm able to see now more clearly is how I don't know if this is the appropriate word, but I'll just use it shorthand, the kind of intersectional analysis that Sara was doing, where what she wanted to do was populate the films with the gestures, the voices of difference that were going to actually allow. I think she believed this, that her work would contribute. I mean, me aporta, my contribution, right? Her work would contribute to the futures of those people who the revolution was going to forget. So maybe, I'm not sure if that answers, but we'll talk more about it, Ketty, in New York.
Susan, and finally, because the time is almost over, Ana Lopez, can you see the question?
Yeah. Very interesting question. You know what, Anna? That's a great idea. I think we should do that. Well, one of the things that maybe we could do is to actually have our, like the portal here at the Vulnerable Media Lab be the host for the originals. And then the people could watch them. And anyway, I think that's a really good question. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Susan. So I want to call back Nils and Istani para despedir el coloquio y para cerrar la conversación. Lamento que hay algunos comentarios y algunas preguntas que se van quedando, pero ya el tiempo no da y definitivamente la conferencia que nos ha, todo esto que nos ha traído Susan al tintero puede crear infinitas conversaciones, tanto por la obra de Sara como por el excelente trabajo de conservación, ese lindo proyecto que está llevando, por el cual te agradecemos, Susan. So, Dani, Nils.
Ya, súper. Bueno, quisiera agradecerle mucho a la doctora Susan Lord por estar con nosotros. Quisiera agradecerle también a todas las personas que nos han acompañado en este proceso que ha sido un proceso largo, casi 2 años. Estábamos conversando el otro día que estuvimos, es increíble, pero así fue, preparando este evento, coordinando todos los detalles, o sea, la preparación, primero estudiar, primero el periodo, después las invitaciones y así. Fue un largo proceso, pero estamos muy felices por haber contado con todos tanto las personas que presentaron como las que hemos tenido comentándonos a través del live, muy agradecidos con todos los sponsors de Yale, de Connecticut, de la Universidad de Chile, Rialta, que ha sido extraordinario, el trabajo que han hecho para apoyarnos en este evento, ¿no? Así que a los cineastas, porque finalmente sin su obra no hubiese sido, o sea, no tendría sentido hacer algo así. Así que a todos, muchísimas gracias y por supuesto a Nils y a Reinaldo. Sin ellos tampoco hubiese sido posible hacer esto, así que gracias.
Sí, agradecer también a todos los panelistas, como decíais, Dani, y a cada uno de estos maravillosos estudiosos y académicos que nos han brindado un pedacito de su tiempo y de agendas que siempre sabemos que son súper complicadas. Pues les agradecemos mucho la confianza y la voluntad de estar aquí, el apoyo, porque bueno, sin la voluntad de ustedes tampoco hubiera habido evento, así que muchas gracias a todos los cineastas, a Violena, a Irene, a Alejandro Alonso, a Carla, a Aparicio, a Eliezer, a Carlos Melián, como decía, a todos los profesores y los estudiosos, a Juan Carlos Rodríguez, a Cristian Saldía, la gente de Chile que también se juntó, Angelito desde Cuba, Dunya, eh, Jacqueline Los, que también ha sido una presencia muy importante y nos ha ayudado en todo el proceso también, a Mónica González, a Laura Empeña, a Astrid, que desde Cuba también se conectó e hizo todo lo posible para estar con nosotros, y ese esfuerzo también se les agradece un montón porque sabemos que desde Cuba es súper difícil. A Justo Plana, no quiero que se me quede nadie, a Laura Soe, a, a Zaira, a Ana López, que nos dio esa maravillosa conferencia magistral ayer, que fue realmente muy, muy interesante y nos hizo pensar mucho sobre el cine cubano contemporáneo. A Eduardo Urios Aparici de la Universidad de Connecticut por moderar nuestro panel. A Diane Luis, que mandó su video, hizo todo lo posible también por estar aquí. Como decía, bueno, decía antes, a Dunya y a Michelle Leigh Farrell from Fairfield, y por supuesto cerrando a la doctora Susan Lord por darnos esta conferencia. Creo que le hemos agradecido a todo el mundo, a las instituciones, al equipo de Rialta, que ha hecho un montón de trabajo de diseño, de promoción, de los técnicos de Rialta han sido maravillosos para que esta transmisión saliera y saliera bien. A todo, también nos ayudaron muchísimo con lo de la muestra de cine. Ellos hicieron posible que estuvieran todas esas películas ahí arriba en Fest Home para que las pudiéramos ver junto con los cineastas, pero ellos generaron la plataforma y nos ayudaron a diseñar eso. Así que por ahí creo que estamos todo el mundo agradeciéndoles a todo el mundo, y no sé si se me queda alguien, pues me dicen. Espero que no. Si se me quedó alguien, les pido disculpas. Y por supuesto a todo el que se juntó por Facebook, por YouTube y por todos lados para estar estos 3 días con nosotros. Ha sido un placer enorme.